Michael Jackson stood at the window of his Berlin hotel suite, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass. His fingers trembled against the cold pain, not from the November chill, but from exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. Outside, thousands of voices chanted his name, a sound that had followed him across continents and decades, a sound that once filled him with purpose but now felt like chains wrapped around his chest. He was 44 years old, and he had never known a day without those voices, without cameras tracking his every breath, without the world demanding more of the boy who had been stolen from childhood and transformed into something both more and less than human. Prince Michael too slept in the adjacent room, barely 9 months old, wrapped in blankets that cost more than most families earned in a year. The baby knew nothing of fame, nothing of the prison his father inhabited, nothing of the price that would be extracted from every moment of joy. Michael had named him after himself, a decision he sometimes questioned in the dark hours before dawn. What kind of father passes on a name that weighs 1,000 pounds? What kind of man brings a child into a world that had shown him no mercy since he was 5 years old, singing in Gary, Indiana, while his father's belt waited in the wings? The hotel room was a fortress of luxury and loneliness. Silk curtains framed walls adorned with priceless art, yet Michael felt trapped in a space smaller than his childhood bedroom had been. His bodyguard stood outside, his assistants waited for instructions, his entire empire revolved around his next move. But in this moment, he was simply a father struggling with a decision that millions of parents make without thought. His fans had been waiting for hours in the cold rain, their dedication unwavering despite the weather, despite the late hour. They had followed him from London to Paris to Berlin, some spending their last savings just to stand beneath his window and scream his name into the night. Grace Ruaramba, the nanny, had suggested bringing the baby to the window. The fans wanted to see Prince, she said. They wanted to witness the newest member of the Jackson legacy. It seemed harmless enough, a simple gesture of gratitude toward people who had given him everything, who had lifted him to heights no entertainer had reached before or since. Michael had done it before with his older children, Prince Michael and Paris, though they had been older, more aware. This was different. Prince too was so small, so fragile, his tiny fingers barely able to grasp Michael's thumb when he held him. The chanting outside grew louder, more insistent. Michael could hear the desperation in their voices, the need for connection with someone they loved from a distance but felt they knew intimately. He understood that need better than anyone. He had spent his entire life trying to bridge the gap between the person he was and the icon the world had created, always falling short, always misunderstood. The tabloids called him strange, disturbed, a cautionary tale of fame's corruption. They analyzed his every word, twisted his every gesture, and turned his attempts at normalcy into headlines that screamed his otherness. But these fans, the ones standing in the rain, they saw something different. They saw the man who had given them Thriller and Billie Jean, who had moonwalked across their television screens and into their hearts, who had sung about healing the world and making it a better place. They saw magic, not madness. They saw genius, not the wounded child trapped inside a man's body. Michael wanted to give them something, a moment of connection, a thank you for their loyalty in a world that increasingly turned against him. He walked to the nursery and lifted his sleeping son from the crib. Prince too stirred but did not wake, his small body warm and trusting in his father's arms. Michael held him close, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The hallway stretched before Michael like a tunnel leading toward judgment. Each step echoed against marble floors as he carried Prince 2 toward the window where his fans waited 4 stories below. His security team flanked him, their faces neutral, trained to facilitate whatever their employer requested without question. Grace walked beside him, her expression concerned but silent. She had learned that Michael made his own choices, regardless of advice, and that her role was to support rather than prevent. The baby remained asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with the peaceful breathing of innocence, unaware that the next 60 seconds would define not just this moment but become a symbol dissected by millions for years to come. The window of the Adlon Hotel suite overlooked a scene of controlled chaos. Barricades held back a sea of humanity, their faces upturned like flowers seeking sunlight, their cameras ready to capture any glimpse of the reclusive superstar. The rain had intensified, but the crowd had grown rather than diminished, as if the weather itself was testing their devotion. Michael could hear them even through the thick glass, their chants synchronized into a singular voice that spoke his name like a prayer. He had inspired this kind of fervor since he was a child, but it never stopped feeling surreal, never stopped making him question whether he was truly worthy of such adoration. His hands shook as he approached the window. Prince 2 weighed almost nothing in his arms, perhaps 20 pounds of bone and flesh and infinite potential, a human being who depended entirely on his father's judgment for safety. Michael had been performing since before he could remember, had faced audiences of hundreds of thousands, had stood on stages where one wrong step meant failure broadcast to millions, yet this simple act of showing his son to his fans filled him with anxiety that twisted his stomach into knots. Something felt wrong, but he could not articulate what. The voice that had guided him through choreography and composition, that had made him the greatest entertainer of his generation, whispered warnings he chose to ignore. The window opened outward, and the sound of the crowd exploded into the room like a physical force. The chanting became deafening, ecstatic, a wall of noise that crashed against Michael's senses. He stepped closer to the opening, and the crowd erupted into screams of joy. They could see him, their idol, their hero, the man who had provided the soundtrack to their lives. Cameras flashed like lightning, creating a strobe effect that turned the moment into something dreamlike and disjointed. Michael smiled and waved with one hand while holding his son with the other, trying to balance gratitude with the growing unease that prickled along his spine. Then, in a decision that would be replayed and analyzed frame by frame, Michael extended his arms and held Prince 2 out over the railing. The baby dangled 4 stories above the concrete below, held only by his father's grip on his torso, a white blanket draped over his face to protect his identity but obscuring his features completely. The gesture lasted perhaps 20 seconds, maybe less, but time seemed to stop entirely. The crowd's screams changed pitch, confusion mixing with excitement. Some fans continued cheering, believing this was simply Michael being Michael, unpredictable and theatrical. Others gasped, their hands flying to their mouths as they recognized the danger in what they were witnessing. Michael bounced the baby slightly, a gesture meant to be playful, to show his son to the people who loved them both. In his mind, he was sharing his joy, his pride in fatherhood, his gratitude for their support. He had performed death-defying stunts on stage, had dangled from cranes and wires, had pushed the boundaries of what audiences expected. This felt like another performance, another moment of connection. But he was not wearing a harness, and his son was not a prop. The rain made the railing slick beneath his arm. The wind pulled at the blanket. Prince 2 remained asleep, trusting completely in the arms that held him suspended between safety and catastrophe. The security team moved closer, their faces no longer neutral but tight with alarm. Grace reached out instinctively, her professional composure cracking. Michael seemed to wake from a trance, pulling his son back inside, cradling him close as if nothing unusual had occurred. He waved again to the crowd, smiled his famous smile, and stepped back from the window. The entire incident had lasted less than a minute, but the damage was already done. Hundreds of cameras had captured every angle. The image was already being transmitted across the globe, racing through news agencies and television stations, about to explode across front pages and break into scheduled programming with urgent updates. As Michael walked back down the hallway, Prince 2 stirred and opened his eyes, looking up at his father with the uncomplicated trust that only a baby can possess. Michael kissed his son's forehead and handed him back to Grace, his hands still trembling. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he had just watched someone else perform those actions, as if the man at the window had been another person entirely. He did not yet understand what he had done, did not yet grasp that the world was about to turn against him with a fury that would dwarf any previous controversy, that this single moment of poor judgment would become evidence in arguments about his fitness as a parent, his mental state, his very humanity. The first phone call came before Michael had even returned to his private quarters. His publicist's voice carried a panic that cut through the post-performance calm Michael had wrapped around himself like armor. The footage was everywhere, spreading like wildfire across news channels that interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts and warning labels. The image of Prince 2 dangling over the balcony had already been looped dozens of times, each replay accompanied by increasingly horrified commentary from anchors who could barely contain their shock. Within hours, what Michael had perceived as a gesture of love had been transformed into an act of criminal recklessness, dissected by experts who questioned everything from his judgment to his sanity. Michael sat frozen in his suite, watching himself on television screens that showed the same clip from every conceivable angle. Wide shots showed the height of the drop. Close-ups captured the looseness of his grip. Slow-motion replays emphasized every dangerous detail, the way the baby's legs kicked in the air, the proximity of his small body to the railing's edge, the whiteness of Michael's knuckles as he held his son suspended above concrete that would show no mercy. Commentators used words like shocking, disturbing, and unbelievable, their voices heavy with judgment. Child safety experts were already being interviewed, their professional opinions uniformly condemning. Legal analysts speculated about potential charges ranging from child endangerment to reckless conduct. The phone rang continuously. His lawyers needed statements. His management needed damage control strategies. His family needed explanations. But Michael could not speak, could not form words that would make anyone understand what he had been thinking, because he himself no longer understood. What had felt natural in the moment now appeared monstrous in retrospect. The disconnect between his intention and the reality captured on camera was so vast that he could not bridge it with words. He had wanted to share his joy, to thank his fans, to show them the newest member of his family. Instead, he had given the world ammunition to use against him for the rest of his life. Social media, still in its relative infancy in late 2002, exploded with outrage. Forums filled with heated debates. Some fans defended him desperately, arguing that the camera angles made the situation look worse than it was, that Michael would never intentionally harm his children, that the media was twisting an innocent moment into a scandal. But they were drowned out by waves of criticism from people who saw the footage as confirmation of every negative story ever written about the pop star. The incident became a cultural touchstone, referenced in late-night monologues and dinner-table conversations, reduced to a punchline or a cautionary tale depending on the audience. By morning, the story had become the lead on every major news outlet across the globe. Newspapers in London, Tokyo, Sydney, and New York ran the image on their front pages beneath headlines that screamed variations of shock and condemnation. Television programs devoted entire segments to analyzing Michael's psychological state, inviting psychologists who had never met him to diagnose his behavior from a distance. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming, a tidal wave of anger that crashed against Michael from every direction. Parenting groups issued statements. Child welfare organizations called for investigations. Politicians, always eager to align themselves with popular sentiment, condemned the behavior as inexcusable regardless of celebrity status. Michael's other children became part of the conversation. Reporters dug through archives for any evidence of questionable parenting, finding photos where Prince Michael and Paris wore masks in public, which Michael had done to protect their privacy but which now appeared sinister, evidence of a man disconnected from normal reality. The custody arrangements for his children were questioned. Calls grew louder for intervention, for child services to investigate whether Prince too was safe in his father's care. The same fans who had stood in the rain chanting Michael's name now faced cameras themselves, asked to comment on what they had witnessed, their excitement curdled into concern. Inside his hotel suite, Michael spiraled into a darkness that felt familiar and inescapable. This was not his first scandal, not his first experience with the world's judgment, but it felt different because it involved his children, the only pure thing in his complicated life. He had survived accusations about his appearance, his behavior, his relationships, but attacks on his parenting cut deeper than anything before. His children were supposed to be separate from the circus, protected from the madness that surrounded him. Now he had dragged Prince 2 into the spotlight in the most damaging way imaginable, had made his infant son the center of a global controversy before he was old enough to speak his first word. Grace brought the baby to him, and Michael held Prince 2 close, tears streaming down his face as he rocked back and forth. The baby cooed and grabbed at his father's face with tiny fingers, completely unaware that his image was being broadcast around the world, that his brief moment of danger had become a symbol of fame's corruption. Michael whispered apologies against his son's soft hair, promises to do better, to think clearer, to protect him from the storm that was only beginning. But even as he made those promises, he knew that some damage could never be undone, that this moment would follow them both forever. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon, arranged hastily by Michael's crisis management team who understood that silence would only make the situation worse. They prepared statements, coached him on talking points, warned him to show contrition without admitting legal liability. But Michael barely heard their instructions, his mind replaying the balcony scene endlessly, searching for the exact moment when his judgment had failed so catastrophically. He had not slept since the incident, his exhaustion compounded by the weight of global condemnation that pressed down on him like physical force. His eyes, always expressive, now carried a haunted quality that no amount of makeup could conceal. The hotel ballroom had been transformed into a media circus. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses focused on the podium where Michael would soon stand. Reporters filled every available seat, their notebooks ready, their questions prepared to extract maximum damage. The air crackled with anticipation, not the excited energy of fans but the predatory hunger of journalists who sensed blood in the water. Michael's security team formed a barrier between him and the press, but they could not protect him from the scrutiny that awaited, could not shield him from questions that had no good answers. When Michael approached the podium, the camera flashes were blinding, a wall of light that turned him into a silhouette against the brightness. He wore sunglasses despite being indoors, a habit that had become part of his public persona but which now seemed like an attempt to hide, to avoid direct confrontation with the judgment he faced. His hands gripped the podium's edges, knuckles white with tension. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the smooth confidence that had defined his performances, none of the charisma that had made him the biggest star in the world. Instead, he sounded broken, a man trying to explain the inexplicable to an audience that had already made up its mind. "I offer no excuses for what happened," Michael began, his prepared statement trembling slightly in his hands. "I made a terrible mistake. I got caught up in the excitement of the moment. I would never intentionally endanger the lives of my children." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, corporate and calculated, the kind of statement written by lawyers rather than spoken from the heart. But his lawyers had been clear that genuine emotion could be twisted, used against him in potential legal proceedings, so he stuck to the script even as every instinct screamed to throw it aside and speak the truth of his confusion and regret. The reporters erupted with questions before he had finished his statement, their voices overlapping into an incomprehensible roar. They wanted details, explanations, admissions of guilt that went beyond the carefully worded apology. How could he have been so careless? Did he understand the danger? What did he say to critics who called him an unfit parent? Had he been drinking or using drugs? The questions came like punches, each one designed to hurt, to provoke, to create a headline more damaging than the last. Michael's publicist tried to maintain order, selecting questions from approved journalists, but the feeding frenzy could not be contained. Michael answered what he could, his voice growing quieter with each response, his body language shrinking inward as if he could make himself small enough to escape the judgment that surrounded him. He explained that he had wanted to show his fans his son, that he had not realized how it would look, that it had happened so quickly he had not thought through the consequences. But every explanation sounded like an excuse, every justification rang false to ears already convinced of his guilt. The press conference lasted less than 30 minutes, but it felt like hours, each question a knife twist in a wound that would not stop bleeding. When it ended, Michael was escorted from the ballroom through a back entrance, protected from the photographers who waited outside to capture his expression of defeat. He returned to his suite and immediately went to the nursery, where Prince II slept peacefully, unaware that his father had just subjected himself to public humiliation on his behalf. Michael sat in the rocking chair beside the crib and watched his son breathe, the steady rise and fall of his tiny chest the only thing that felt real in a world that had become surreal and hostile. The apology did not quell the outrage, if anything, it intensified the criticism. Analysts picked apart his statement word by word, finding insincerity in his tone, inadequacy in his contrition. The fact that he wore sunglasses became evidence of his disconnect from reality, his inability to face the consequences of his actions directly. Editorial pages filled with op-eds calling for serious consequences, for investigations that would determine whether Michael's children were safe in his care. Child Protective Services in California announced they would review the case, though German authorities where the incident occurred had jurisdiction. Late-night comedians turned the apology into material for their monologues, mocking Michael's appearance, his voice, his whole persona. The balcony incident became a cultural reference point, shorthand for celebrity excess and disconnection from normal reality. Saturday Night Live prepared sketches. Cartoonists drew unflattering caricatures. The jokes were brutal and relentless, transforming Michael from a human being who made a mistake into a punchline, a figure of ridicule rather than sympathy. Even people who had previously defended him found it difficult to explain away footage that showed such obvious poor judgment. Michael stopped watching the news, stopped reading newspapers, tried to create a bubble of silence around himself and his children. But the story penetrated every defense, friends calling with concern, family members expressing disappointment, business associates worried about how this would affect his ability to work. His upcoming projects were put on hold. Sponsors reconsidered their associations. The financial implications were significant, but the emotional toll was incalculable. Michael had survived many controversies, but this felt different, more personal, more damaging, because it struck at the core of his identity as a father, the one role he valued above all others. The months that followed the balcony incident stretched into years, but the shadow never lifted. Michael moved through his life like a ghost haunting his own existence, performing when contractual obligated, smiling for cameras when necessary, but the light that had once burned so brightly within him had been dimmed to something barely visible. The incident became a permanent entry in his biography, referenced in every article written about him, included in every television profile, brought up in every interview regardless of the intended topic. He could not escape it, could not outlive it, could not create enough new moments to bury this single terrible mistake beneath accomplishments and acts of kindness. Prince too grew from an infant into a toddler, then a young boy, completely unaware of the incident that had defined him before he could form memories. Michael called him Blanket, a nickname born from the white cloth that had covered his face during those terrible seconds on the balcony, a name that some saw as inappropriate given the circumstances but which Michael insisted was a term of endearment, a symbol of comfort and protection. The boy was kept even more isolated than his siblings, rarely photographed, his life carefully controlled to prevent any repeat of the media circus that had consumed his first year. Michael's relationship with his fans changed after Berlin. Some remained loyal, defended him against all criticism, argued that everyone made mistakes and that his lifetime of generosity and artistry should not be erased by one moment of poor judgment. But others, even those who had loved him deeply, found themselves unable to reconcile the image of the man who sang about healing the world with the man who had dangled his baby over a balcony. The trust had been broken, and trust once lost is almost impossible to fully restore. His concerts still sold out, his albums still topped charts, but the magic had been tarnished, replaced by a sadness that audiences could feel emanating from the stage. The legal consequences were less severe than many had predicted. German prosecutors investigated but ultimately declined to press charges, determining that while the action was reckless, there was no evidence of intentional harm or ongoing danger to the child. California's Child Protective Services conducted their own review, interviewing nannies and staff, examining the living conditions at Neverland Ranch, but found no grounds for removing the children from Michael's custody. The legal system, at least, gave him the benefit of the doubt that public opinion had denied. But the court that mattered most, the court of public perception, had already delivered its verdict, and there was no appeal. In private conversations with the few people he trusted, Michael tried to explain what had happened, to articulate the disconnect between his intention and the reality of his actions. He talked about how the boundaries between performance and life had blurred for him after decades in the spotlight, how every moment felt like it was being watched and judged, so he had learned to live as if he were always on stage. The balcony had felt like another stage, the fans below an audience waiting for a show, and he had given them what he thought they wanted without considering that his son was not a prop to be displayed but a vulnerable human being whose safety should have overridden every other consideration. These explanations helped those who heard them understand, but they could not undo the damage or change the narrative that had solidified in the public consciousness. Michael Jackson became, in the eyes of many, a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of fame, about what happens when someone lives so long inside a bubble of privilege and enablement that they lose touch with basic common sense. The incident was used in parenting classes as an example of what not to do, in psychology courses as a case study of celebrity disconnect, in media studies programs as a perfect storm of image management failure. The other scandals that would later engulf Michael's life, accusations far more serious than a moment of reckless parenting, somehow never quite overshadowed the balcony incident in the public imagination. Perhaps because this one was captured on camera, indisputable in its basic facts even if the interpretation varied. Perhaps because it involved an innocent baby who could not defend himself or explain away the danger. Perhaps because it confirmed suspicions that many had harbored about Michael for years, that beneath the genius and the generosity was something broken, something that could not function in the normal world. When Michael died in June 2009, the balcony incident was featured prominently in almost every obituary, every career retrospective, every tribute that attempted to summarize his complex life. Footage of that November day in Berlin was played alongside clips of the moonwalk, his Super Bowl performance, his humanitarian efforts. It had become as much a part of his legacy as his music, a moment that defined him as much as his artistry. In death, as in life, Michael could not escape the consequences of those 20 seconds when his judgment failed and the world watched in horror. Prince Michael Joseph Jackson II, the boy once known as Blanket, eventually learned about the incident that had marked his entrance into public consciousness. He saw the footage, read the articles, understood that his father had made a mistake that cost them both dearly. But unlike the millions who judged from a distance, he knew Michael not as an icon or a controversy but as a father who loved fiercely, who made mistakes but never stopped trying to protect his children from a world that had shown him no mercy. He carries that knowledge with him, a different kind of burden than the one his father carried, but a burden nonetheless. The balcony at the Adlon Hotel in Berlin remains, a physical location that has become a pilgrimage site for some fans and a symbol of tragedy for others. The hotel has considered removing the balcony or altering its appearance, but it remains unchanged, a monument to a moment when the world glimpsed the dangerous intersection of fame, judgment, and human fallibility. Michael held his son's hand many times after that November day, in private moments away from cameras, teaching him to walk, comforting him through nightmares, being the father he always wanted to be despite the world's insistence that he was incapable of the role. But it was those 20 seconds on the balcony, when he held his son not by the hand but suspended over danger, that the world remembered, that the world could not forgive, that the world would never let either of them forget.